Hello, friends, and welcome back. It's good to be back. Today, we're talking about a question that's personal and important to a lot of us. And the question is, what is our responsibility in response to all the suffering and injustice that we see in this world? How are we supposed to follow Jesus in a world that's losing its mind and its heart and its soul? What can you and I actually do about all the massive problems that we see all day, every day on the news? And this internal stuff that we're doing, the spirituality and the growth and the mysticism and the drawing closer to God, what impact is that supposed to have on the world around us, the world that God made and loves, the world that Christ died to save? We will look at the political answer and why it's not good enough for Christian mystics. And then we'll look at what Jesus said and what the apostles wrote. And then we'll look at the early church's witness and how they took Jesus' teaching and actually applied it in a world that was hostile to everything that they were doing. We'll look at the old Christian mystics and what they said and what they practiced when it came to charity and mercy. And then I'll give you some practical advice for what it's worth from my own experience. Just to set the stage, this video is an answer to a question from my friend George. George's question is, hey John, I think that with the news and social movements going on, sometimes I find myself getting upset or frustrated at the world around me. I don't think that looking at the log in my own eye is helping me cope with these things, and I wanted to ask for some guidance. George is somebody that I met during the pandemic, and he was actually around the fire circle with us as we went through what eventually became Jesus, a Field Manual. He has since moved away, and we miss you, George. George sent me this question a few months ago, and I'm sorry, George, I wasn't ignoring you. I just thought that your question was so good that I needed to share it with others, and it took me a bit to get to it. George's original question mentioned a few specific social issues that were upsetting to him, and I left them out because I want all of you to actually hear what I have to say instead of debating those specific issues in the comments. But everything I say today will apply to the specific things that George asked about, and they will apply to many of the other things that we see in the news, and probably whatever it is that's on the news that's closest to your heart. And with these things, George is right. I mean, looking at the pain and the suffering and the injustice in this world, and then just admitting that I'm also sinful, I'm also imperfect, some of these things, that's not enough. And Jesus himself demands more from his followers. So let's talk about righteous anger and what to do with it. A lot of us feel moral outrage, righteous anger, because of what we see happening in the world. There's so much going on that is not good and not what God wants for us and for creation. And if you feel angry when you see people being exploited and abused and neglected and killed, well, that's just the right response. That's your soul correctly identifying that something is wrong and that something needs to change. The problem with righteous anger is that there are systems of power in this world that have figured out how to use it for their own benefit, how to inflame your moral outrage, how to monetize it, how to use it to manipulate you to gain more power and influence for themselves. They say, look at this, something horrible is happening. And you go, oh no, that is horrible. And then they say, we need to make radical societal changes to eliminate the conditions that allow for this kind of suffering. And you say, yeah, I agree. And then they say, to make radical changes, we need power. And to get power, we all need to unite under one authority and vote together. And you go, yeah, I guess so. And then they say, therefore, voting for our specific political party is the highest moral and social duty of every citizen and every Christian. And you go, wait, what? I thought we were talking about all the horrible stuff that was happening and what we can do about it. And they say, we are, and what you can do is vote for us. In our system, here in the United States, that is the argument from both political parties. At this point, the only thing that most Americans know how to do is debate which political party, out of only two choices, best reflects our values. And somehow, a lot of us have been talked into believing that having correct political opinions is the same thing as following Christ. Just think about that for a second. Who benefits from that mindset? Only the political parties and the power structures of this world. But a lot of people are stuck and they're unable to think about anything in their lives, including spiritual things, outside of a framework that has been defined for them by the news and by politicians. Now, there is a way out for Christians, and that's the direct personal experience of Christ and a radical commitment to Jesus and his way, what we call Christian mysticism. Once you actually know Jesus for yourself in your own experience, then you become committed to him and him alone, and you can't be drawn in by the powers of this world that just want to use you for their own advantage. The Dutch writer Hub Welsen writes, mystical experience with the biblical text affects people's behavior. Their dealings with people and society change. They become alert to the plight of the socially marginalized. Their conscience cannot disregard injustice. People rearrange the hierarchy of values by which they live and become critical of the generally accepted hierarchy of values in their environment. That's another way of saying that mystical experience with Christ frees us from the red versus blue illusion of choice that we're all trapped in. But if you've had an experience like this, then you know that a true spiritual awakening only makes our awareness of injustice and the righteous anger that we feel about it much, much worse. So we have a dilemma. Now we can see the problems in the world even better than we could see them before. And we can empathize with others and feel their pain at a deep level. But now we also know that the power system of politics, even if we could bend it in our direction, is not the answer. So what are we supposed to do about the injustice and the suffering in the world around us? Well, Jesus had a lot of radical things to say about what we're supposed to do with our righteous anger and to impact the world around us. And he backed them up with his own example. We're going to read a bunch of Bible verses, and if you'd like to follow along, they're in the pinned comment underneath this video. Matthew 5:16. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. It's our job to go out there and be proactive and do good, not just hide from evil, not just keep ourselves pure and clean, but actually engage the world in a positive and compassionate way. And then everything else he says flows from there. Matthew 5:42, give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Matthew 6:2-4, so whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And then there's Jesus' literal last word on charity and mercy and how we impact the world. This is Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 34. By the way, for all the Christians in your life that are really excited about Judgment Day, make sure they know the standard by which we will be judged. This is a parable that Jesus tells about separating the sheep from the goats, which is a metaphor for what will happen in the end times according to Jesus. Matthew 25:34. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. The radical teaching and example of Jesus is that he makes each of us personally responsible to sacrifice our comfort and our resources for the well-being of others. This isn't a policy or a party or a program. It's a personal, one-to-one, voluntary commitment to Jesus that he expects us to act on through works of mercy for the well-being of other people. So, according to Jesus, what are we supposed to do about all the injustice and suffering in the world? We're supposed to get our hands dirty, loving others in any way we can, just like Jesus did. And that's also what the apostles taught. In Romans chapter 12, verse 17, Paul writes, do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what's noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What are we supposed to do with all of our righteous anger? We're not supposed to fight evil or avoid evil. We are supposed to overcome evil with good. That is incredibly difficult and incredibly proactive, and it puts all the responsibility on us. But remember that in Paul's thinking, we're the only people in this world that actually have the Holy Spirit of Christ empowering us to do this. So it isn't about you and me getting organized and being smart enough and being strong enough to defeat the evil that's in this world. It's about reflecting the light of Christ and letting the Spirit of Christ work through us to execute his mission of restoration and liberation and renewal. For the apostles, this wasn't abstract or theoretical at all. For them, obeying Jesus was actually getting our hands dirty in the service of others. John writes in 1 John 3:16, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and in action. What the early church did with the teaching of Jesus and of Paul and of John is an extremely useful example for us today. The early church had no hopes of gaining any power. They could not legislate their version of faith and morality onto everyone around them. They had to obey Christ by taking personal responsibility for the well-being of others at great cost to themselves in a world that was hostile to everything that they were doing. And there are a lot of examples of this, but there are two that always come to mind when I think about this. The first one is what the early Christians did when the Roman Empire was stricken by plagues. So there were a few plagues that hit the Roman Empire in the first few centuries of the church. And the people that were sick were so contagious that a lot of Roman citizens, when their loved ones got sick or died, they really just disposed of their bodies as fast as they possibly could by dumping them in the street. And there were even bodies that had the plague that were in the public water supply. And there was no one around that wanted to go near any of these dead people and bury them. And sometimes sick people were pushed out of the house and made to wander the street with no one to care for them because the rest of the family didn't want to get sick. But the early Christians would set up hospital tents and nurse these people back to health if they could. They would provide burial and disposal of bodies so that the water supply and the streets of the town could be free of disease. And a lot of these Christians, by helping other people recover from these diseases, they caught those diseases themselves and they themselves started to die. And so there were tents of Christians who were dying of the plague that they had nursed people back from. And from these tents, people could hear these Christians singing hymns and songs and praising God because they were so delighted that they had been found worthy to give their lives for the well-being of other people in the imitation of Christ. Love at great cost to themselves is the example and the witness of the early church. Another thing that the early church did that comes to mind is in Roman society, if you didn't want a baby for any reason, it was more or less acceptable to leave the child out in a wilderness place so that it would die of exposure. Raising children in the ancient world was very expensive, and sometimes families needed a male child to inherit all of the family's property, and they didn't want to deal with the expense of raising a girl, or sometimes they were just children who were unwanted. So these children that were abandoned in the wilderness, they would either die of exposure or they would be killed by animals, or probably worst of all, they were picked up by the kind of people who would go out into the wilderness looking for free children. So they would end up as temple prostitutes. And there was a lot of, we'll just call it child trafficking back then in connection with Roman religion. So the early Christians took it upon themselves to go into these wilderness places, pick up these children that had been abandoned, and raise them as members of their own family, again, at great expense to themselves. They weren't trying to pass healthcare reform, they were just caring for the sick. They weren't trying to pass laws against abandoning your baby to die from exposure. They were just raising those kids. And by contrast, our logic right now is that if we gain enough power and pass the right laws, then none of us will have to make the efforts and the sacrifices that our spiritual ancestors made. And that right there is the lie that keeps Christians today from personally obeying and embodying and even caring about Jesus Christ. Our spiritual ancestors gave their lives to love people who hated and persecuted them. And today we're crying about the cups at Starbucks not being Christmassy enough. It's embarrassing. And we aren't worthy to untie the sandals of the Christians who went before us. Now let's talk about the Christian mystics. The early Christian mystics withdrew from the world to live in the desert or in monastic communities. And if you don't know any better, then their detachment might look like they were abandoning the world to its suffering so that they could go somewhere to concentrate on being spiritual. But in their teaching and in their practice, the people that we think of as mystics continued in the spirit of Christ and in the teaching of the apostles. Here's an example. Saint Basil the Great, one of the Cappadocian fathers, in a homily on Luke, wrote that now someone who takes a man who is clothed and renders him naked would be termed a robber. But when someone fails to clothe the naked while he is able to do so, is such a man deserving of any other name? The bread which you hold back belongs to the hungry. The coat which you guard in your locked storage chests belongs to the naked. The footwear rotting away in your closet belongs to those without shoes. The silver that you keep hidden in a safe place belongs to the one in need. Thus, the people you could have provided for are the people to whom you have done wrong. Again, it doesn't get any more practical or personal than that. And then in the Middle Ages, Meister Eckhart wrote, if someone is in a state of mystical ecstasy, even as high as that of Paul, and knew that beside him there was a sick man who needed a bowl of soup, it would be better for him to abandon his ecstatic vision and serve the needy man. There are countless stories of individual monks and hermits caring for all kinds of people and creatures in all kinds of ways. Many of the early monastic communities did regular physical labor to either help the poor at their tasks or to raise money to give to the poor. And in the Middle Ages, many monastic communities reorganized to provide reliable education and healthcare to their communities because they saw those things as part of their spiritual duties. And many mystics advocated for human rights to the ruling class on behalf of the poor. Again, they saw all of that as just simply part of their obedience to Christ and their service of their fellow human beings. We cannot repeat this point enough. The spirit of Christian mysticism was to just do the Jesus thing as well as we possibly can, inside and out. And if we're going to take Jesus seriously, we have to take his teaching seriously on how we're supposed to impact the world and care for the people and the creatures around us. Because for Christian mystics, true enlightenment is not abandoning the world to its suffering and its pain. Real enlightenment is sharing the heart of Christ for all of God's creatures. Here's a quote from St. Isaac, and this one is extreme. St. Isaac writes, "What is a merciful heart? It is a heart on fire for the whole creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals, even for demons and for all that exists. By the recollection of them, the eyes of a merciful person pour forth tears in abundance. By the strong and vehement mercy that grips such a person's heart, and by such great compassion, the heart is humbled, and one cannot bear to hear or to see any injury or slight sorrow in any in creation. For this reason, such a person offers up tearful prayer continually, even for irrational beasts, for the enemies of the truth, and for those who harm her or him, that they may be protected and receive mercy. And in like manner, such a person prays for the family of reptiles because of the great compassion that burns without measure in a heart that is in the likeness of God." If that's too radical for you, 1 John 4:20. "Those who say, 'I love God,' and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." So, look, there is a lot of injustice and suffering and evil in the world, and you're right to feel righteous anger about all of it. But what use is it to just sit around stressed out about it? And we also have to admit, as spiritually conscious people, that we are not going to fix anything by supporting the power structures that enable and drive a lot of the injustice and the suffering in the world around us. So, what do we do to help the world? And what do we do with all of that righteous anger? My advice: follow the example of Christ and of the apostles and of the early church and of all the mystics and martyrs that have gone before. Get your hands dirty helping someone. Take personal responsibility for the well being of others in a way that costs you comfort and time and resources. And you might ask, what can I do about all the world's problems? Here's the truth: you can't do much, but you can do something which is better than nothing. Find a way to serve, a way that's small and personal and humble and committed enough that you can actually do it. If you care about homelessness, help a homeless person. If you don't know how, there are countless churches and organizations that are already doing it. Find one, join them, learn. If you care about immigration, help an immigrant. If you care about poverty, help a poor and hungry person. If you care about the environment, I have a friend who lives in a major city and he just walks around a little bit each day, picking up trash and giving coffee to homeless people and talking to drug addicts about their problems. Jesus says that even if we can only give a drink of cold water to a little one in the name of a disciple, if that's all we can do, we won't lose our reward. And again, I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't it be better to fix the system? Yes, of course it would be better to fix the system. The world needs to be saved. We know this. But we also know that the system is not getting fixed until every human being recovers the image of God within us by submitting our lives to the will and example of Jesus Christ. And that has to start somewhere, which means it has to start with me in whatever way I can manage right now. Not only is that true enlightenment, it's also how Christians throughout history have impacted the world in the most powerful ways. And yes, I know, Christians right now do not have a reputation for compassionate action. But if you want more Christians out there doing what Jesus taught, then you have to go out there and be one. Take your broken heart and your empathy for the suffering of this world and your righteous anger and go find a place to put it all to work for the well-being of someone else. If you know of a church or an organization in your community that is doing that kind of work, leave it in the comments below so that someone else can find it and join in. How cool would it be if us mystical types got off the internet and started to connect with each other in real life by serving others? That would be Christ formed in us, would it not? We'll end with one more passage from 1 John. 1 John 3, 21 through 24. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have boldness before God, and we receive from him whatever we ask, because we obey his commandments and do what pleases him. And this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son Jesus Christ and love one another just as he has commanded us. All who obey his commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit that he has given us.